August 1st, 1943, Rendova Harbor, Solomon Islands. At 02:47 hours, Lieutenant Robert Searles pressed his face against the rubber eyepiece of the TBY-1 radar scope and watched 4 massive contacts crawling across the green phosphorescent screen. Range 2,400 yards, bearing 315 degrees, speed 28 knots. Behind him, the 3 Packard V-12 engines of PT-109 idled at 600 RPM, gurgling seawater through their exhaust ports. The plywood deck vibrated beneath his boots. 78 feet of laminated mahogany and marine glue against 380 feet of welded steel plate. 4 Mark VIII torpedoes with documented 30% dude rates against 8 5-inch naval guns that could punch through a concrete bunker at 10,000 yards. The Japanese destroyer Amagiri displaced 2,090 tons. PT-109 displaced 56 tons fully loaded. The destroyer's hull was armoured with 8mm steel plate. PT-109's hull was 3/4-inch plywood over oak frames. One direct hit from a destroyer's main battery would vaporize the PT boat before the crew knew they were dead. The mathematics were absolute. The conclusion was obvious. And yet Searles had orders to attack. 6 weeks earlier, at the Naval Operations Briefing in Guadalcanal, a Japanese naval intelligence officer's intercepted report had been translated and circulated among American commanders. The document referred to PT boats as hakuge, mosquito boats, toys of plywood that American industry produced because it lacked the steel and expertise to build real warships. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained institutional contempt for small craft. Their doctrine, written in the 1920s and refined through China campaigns, emphasized heavy units. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. The bigger the ship, the greater its value. PT boats didn't register as legitimate threats. They were curiosities, experimental craft, coastal defense units suitable only for harbor patrol and training exercises. The US Navy's own brass shared similar skepticism. PT boats had been in combat since December 1941, operating in the Philippines under Lieutenant John Bulkeley's command, then expanding throughout the Pacific. By summer 1943, 15 squadrons operated across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Aleutians. In 18 months of combat, they had sunk barges, damaged supply ships, harassed landing craft. They had never sunk a destroyer. Not one. The official Naval War College assessment, dated May 1943, concluded that PT boats lacked the firepower, protection, and reliability to engage major warships. The report recommended their use be limited to coastal harassment and special operations. The boats cost $250,000 each to build. Destroyers cost $2 million. The tonnage disparity made destroyer versus PT boat combat mathematically impossible. Steel defeated plywood, weight defeated speed, armor defeated desperation. But Admiral William Halsey, commanding South Pacific operations, had a problem that mathematics couldn't solve. The Tokyo Express. Japanese destroyer runs down the slot between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, delivering troops and supplies to isolated garrisons at Vila and Munda. The destroyers ran at night, 30+ knots, dropped their cargo, and returned to Rabaul before American aircraft could intercept at dawn. These weren't cargo vessels. These were Fubuki-class destroyers, Kagero-class destroyers, warships designed to fight other warships, now reduced to high-speed supply runs because American air superiority made conventional convoy operations suicidal. But destroyer supply runs worked. Every night, Japanese destroyers brought reinforcements. Every night, American ground forces faced fresh enemy troops the next morning. The campaign for New Georgia was stalling because the Japanese could resupply faster than Americans could advance. PT boats were the only Allied assets capable of intercepting the Tokyo Express. Too small for destroyer radar to reliably detect until close range. fast enough to intercept 40+ knots in calm seas. Expendable enough that losing 3 or 4 boats wouldn't cripple American naval strength. But they had to prove they could kill destroyers, not just harass them. On the night of August 1st, intelligence confirmed 4 Japanese destroyers would make the Vila run. 4 ships, route predictable, timing precise. Halsey's operations staff calculated that 15 PT boats, deployed in coordinated divisions across Blackett Strait, could intercept. What they couldn't calculate was whether plywood torpedoes could sink steel warships before steel guns obliterated plywood boats. Searles had read the intelligence assessments. He knew the Japanese considered PT boats beneath notice. He knew American admirals considered PT boats desperate measures. He commanded a 56-ton boat made of wood and gasoline, armed with temperamental torpedoes and 20mm guns that couldn't penetrate destroyer armor. The 11 men aboard PT-109 understood they were attacking targets that outweighed them 40-1, outgunned them 10-1, out-armored them infinitely. The crew called PT boats plywood wonders. The Japanese called them floating coffins. At 02:47 hours on August 2nd, with 4 Japanese destroyers bearing down at 28 knots and 2,400 yards range closing, Searles advanced his throttles and turned PT-109 toward the contacts. Behind him, 14 other PT boats were converging from different positions. The Tokyo Express was 3 minutes from interception range. The plywood boats were about to prove that tonnage meant nothing when desperation moved faster than steel could turn. At 1800 hours on August 1st, 15 PT boat commanders assembled in the operations tent at Rendova Harbor. The briefing officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly, unrolled a chart of Blackett Strait across a plywood table still damp from afternoon rain. 4 red markers represented Japanese destroyers. 15 blue markers represented PT boats. The mathematics on that chart told a story that contradicted 2 centuries of naval doctrine. Intelligence had confirmed the Tokyo Express departure from Rabaul at 14:20 hours. 4 destroyers, Amagiri, Hagikaze, Arashi, and Shigura. Combined displacement 8,400 tons. Combined armament 32 5-inch guns, 16 25mm anti-aircraft mounts, 64 depth charges, and 32 torpedo tubes. Crew complement 1,280 sailors. The destroyers would transit Blackett Strait between 2200 and 0200 hours, drop supplies at Vila Harbor, and return to Rabaul before dawn. Their route was predictable because geography offered limited alternatives. The strait was 7 miles wide at its narrowest point, bounded by Kolombangara Island to the north and Arundel Island to the south. The Japanese had run this route 43 times since June. They had never been successfully intercepted. Kelly's plan positioned the 15 PT boats in 5 3-boat divisions spread across a 12-mile arc. Division 1 would patrol the northern approaches. Division 2 would cover the center strait. Division 3 would position near Bambari Harbor. Division 4 would patrol southern approaches. Division 5 would serve as reserve and pursuit. Each division would maintain radio silence until contact, then coordinate attacks through brief transmissions. The tactical doctrine was simple because PT boat weapons permitted no complexity. The Mark VIII torpedo, standard armament for PT boats in August 1943, carried a 466-pound Torpex warhead. Effective range was 6,000 yards at 36 knots or 10,000 yards at 27 knots. The torpedoes were designed to detonate on contact with a magnetic influence exploder as backup. Combat reports from 18 months of Pacific operations documented systematic failures. Torpedoes ran too deep, passing beneath target hulls. Magnetic exploders detonated prematurely or failed to detonate at all. Contact exploders crumpled on impact without triggering. Official dud rate was estimated at 30%. Actual combat dud rate was closer to 50%. PT boats carried 4 torpedoes in 2 twin-tube launchers, 1 mount port, 1 mount starboard. Reload capability was 0. 4 shots. Then the boat was effectively unarmed, except for anti-aircraft guns useless against armored warships. Firing solutions required closing to within 1,000 yards, preferably 500 yards, for reliable hits. At 500 yards, a Japanese destroyer's 5-inch guns could fire point blank. The shell flight time at that range was less than 2 seconds. A PT boat presented a target 78 feet long and 20 feet wide. A single 5-inch high-explosive shell anywhere on the hull would detonate 200 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline. The resulting fireball would kill the crew before they could abandon ship. Every PT boat commander in that tent understood the mathematics. Close to 500 yards, fire 4 torpedoes hoping 2 worked, then escape at maximum speed while destroyer guns tried to kill you. The tactics weren't sophisticated, they were suicidal. But Kelly had calculated one advantage the Japanese didn't know PT boats possessed. The Elco 80-foot PT boats, which comprised the Rendova squadron, could sustain 40 knots in moderate seas. Japanese destroyers could make 35 knots maximum. PT boats were faster, but only if their engines didn't fail. Each boat carried 3 Packard IV-M 2500 V-12 engines, producing 1,500 horsepower each. Total horsepower, 4,500. The engines burned fuel at 120 gallons per hour at cruising speed, 300 gallons per hour at combat speed. Fuel capacity was 3,000 gallons. Endurance at combat speed was 10 hours theoretically, 6 hours realistically after accounting for maneuvering and reserves. The engines were temperamental. Magnetos fouled. Carburetors iced. Cooling systems failed. Mechanics worked continuously keeping them running. A single engine failure reduced speed to 28 knots, slower than the destroyers they needed to intercept. Kelly distributed attack positions with coordinates and timing. Division commanders plotted courses on their own charts. Questions focused on practical problems. What if torpedoes malfunctioned during firing sequence? Fire anyway and clear the area. What if Japanese destroyers split formation? Each division engages nearest target independently. What if PT boats took damage during approach? Damaged boats withdraw. Intact boats press attack. The briefing contained no discussion of victory or survival odds. These were absent because calculating them was pointless. 15 wooden boats would attack 4 steel destroyers. Some boats would be sunk. Some torpedoes would malfunction. The only meaningful question was whether enough torpedoes would work and enough boats would survive to sink enough destroyers to justify the losses. At 19:30 hours, the commanders returned to their boats. Crews were already conducting pre-combat preparations. Engine mechanics checked oil levels, coolant pressures, and magneto gaps. Torpedo men inspected Mark VIII warheads and arming mechanisms. Gunners loaded 20mm ammunition, 1,800 rounds per boat. Radio men tested TBY-1 radar sets and VHF transceivers. Cooks distributed coffee and sandwiches because no one knew when they would eat again. At 2100 hours, engines started. The sound was distinctive. 3 Packard V-12s per boat. 45 engines total across 15 boats. 202,500 horsepower idling in Rendova Harbor. At 21:30 hours, the first division departed. Every 3 minutes, another division followed. By 21:45 hours, all 15 PT boats were at sea, running dark, no navigation lights, no radio transmissions, invisible except on radar. At 21:47 hours, the radar operator on PT 109 called contact. 4 targets, bearing 290 degrees, range 12,000 yards, speed 28 knots. The Tokyo Express was exactly on schedule. At 2147 hours, The radar operator on PT-109 watched 4 bright dots move across his green screen. Range 12,000 yards. The Japanese destroyers were 6 miles away and closing. Searles calculated intercept geometry in his head. The destroyers were moving at 28 knots on a straight course toward Vila Harbor. PT-109 was making 25 knots on an angle to cut them off. At current speeds, they would meet in 18 minutes. Searles pressed the radio transmit button twice. 2 clicks. The signal told other PT boats that contact was confirmed. No words, just clicks. Speaking on radio would give away their position. Around Blackett Strait, 14 other PT boat commanders heard those 2 clicks and adjusted their courses toward the intercept point. At 22:13 hours, Searles saw them. 4 dark shapes against darker water, visible only because they blocked the stars on the horizon. Range 6,000 yards, 3 miles. The destroyers were massive. Even at this distance, their size was obvious. Bow waves glowed white with phosphorescence. Wakes stretched behind them like luminous ribbons. The lead destroyer was Amagiri. Behind it came Hagikaze, then Arashi, then Shigure. They travelled in single file, 400 yards between each ship. Standard formation for narrow water transit. The formation made them predictable. It also meant attacking one ship without being seen by the others was impossible. Searles reduced speed to 18 knots. Engine noise decreased. The plywood hull stopped pounding against waves. Stealth mattered more than speed now. PT-109 was bow on to the Japanese formation, presenting the smallest possible silhouette. The boat's dark grey paint made it nearly invisible against black water. At 22:29 hours, Searles turned PT-109 to starboard. The turn positioned his port torpedo tubes toward the destroyer formation. 3 other PT boats from Division 2 followed his turn. They were spreading out, creating a firing line 600 yards wide. Each boat would attack from slightly different angles. The Japanese would have to choose which target to shoot at. They couldn't shoot all 4 boats at once. Range closed to 3,000 yards, then 2,000 yards. The destroyers maintained course and speed. Their lookouts hadn't spotted the PT boats, yet. At 1,500 yards, Searles could see details through his binoculars. Gun turrets, antenna masts, men moving on deck. The lead destroyer's bow cut through water smoothly. No zigzagging, no evasive maneuvers. The Japanese were confident. At 22:41 hours, Division 1 attacked from the north. 3 PT boats opened throttles and charged toward Amagiri at 40 knots. The sudden acceleration created rooster tails of spray 30 feet high. The phosphorescent wakes were visible for miles. Searchlights snapped on from the destroyer. Brilliant white beams swept across black water, hunting for targets. The beams found Division 1 boats at 1,800 yards. Gun flashes erupted from Amagiri's forward turrets. The 5-inch guns fired in sequence. Orange muzzle flashes lit up the destroyer's superstructure. 4 seconds later, shells arrived. Massive waterspouts erupted around the charging PT boats. Each explosion threw up columns of water 40 feet tall. The sound was deafening even at 2,000 yards. 1 PT boat jinked left, another jinked right. The third kept charging straight. At 22:47 hours and 800 yards range, all 3 boats fired torpedoes. 12 Mark VIII torpedoes entered the water, running at 36 knots toward Amagiri. The PT boats immediately turned hard and ran. Full throttle, maximum speed, escaping before the destroyer's guns found them. Searles watched through binoculars. 8 torpedoes missed, passing ahead or behind the destroyer. 3 torpedoes ran too deep, passing underneath the hull without detonating. 1 torpedo hit. The explosion occurred amidships, slightly below the waterline. A brilliant orange flash. A column of water and debris shot upward. The explosion sound reached PT-109 3 seconds later, a deep underwater boom that rattled teeth. Amagiri shuddered. The destroyer's bow lifted, Its stern settled, but it kept moving. One torpedo hit wasn't enough to stop a 2,090-ton warship. At 22:53 hours, the three remaining Japanese destroyers broke formation. Hajikaze turned north. Arashi turned south. Shigawa maintained course but increased speed to 32 knots. The neat single-file formation was gone. The destroyers were spreading out, making themselves harder targets. Searles saw his opportunity. Hajikaze had turned directly toward Division II's position. Range was 1,400 yards and closing. The destroyer was charging toward them at 32 knots, probably trying to run down the PT boats that had just attacked Amagiri. Searles advanced his throttles. PT-109 accelerated to 35 knots. The other three boats in Division II matched his speed. They formed a line abreast, charging toward Hajikaze head-on. At 22:57 hours and 200 yards, Hajikaze's searchlights found them. The white beams locked onto PT-109. Searles squinted against the glare. He could see nothing beyond the light. Then muzzle flashes. The destroyer was firing. Shells screamed overhead. One passed so close that the supersonic crack was like a lightning strike. Water erupted to port. Water erupted to starboard. Searles held course. At 900 yards, he turned PT-109 hard to port. The turn presented his port torpedo tubes broadside to Hajikaze. At 23:01 hours and 700 yards range, Searles fired both port torpedoes. The compressed air launch system whooshed. Two Mark VIII torpedoes dropped into the water and accelerated toward the charging destroyer. Searles spun the wheel hard starboard and opened throttles to maximum. PT-109's three Packard engines screamed. The boat leaped forward, reaching 41 knots within seconds. Behind them, the other three Division II boats fired their torpedoes and ran. 12 more torpedoes in the water. 16 total heading toward Hajikaze. The destroyer tried to turn. Its rudder went hard over, but 2,090 tons of steel moving at 32 knots couldn't turn fast enough. At 0:03 hours, 3 torpedoes hit within 5 seconds. The first hit the bow. The second hit amidships. The third hit the stern. The explosions merged into one continuous blast. Hajikaze's bow section separated from the hull. The destroyer broke in half. Both sections sank in 4 minutes. 280 sailors went down with the ship. 3 destroyers remained. At 00:15 hours, the 3 remaining Japanese destroyers regrouped 8 miles northwest of where Hajikaze had sunk. Amagiri was damaged but functional, taking water through the torpedo hole but still capable of 28 knots. Arashi and Shigawa were undamaged. The destroyer commanders communicated by signal lamp. Their orders from Rabaul were clear: deliver supplies to Rendova Harbor, then return. But 15 American PT boats were scattered across Blackett Strait between them and their objective. The Japanese commanders made their decision. They would hunt the PT boats first, eliminate the threat, then proceed with the supply mission. 3 destroyers turned southeast and began sweeping the strait with searchlights. They were no longer prey. They were hunters. PT-109 had expended all 4 torpedoes. Searles ordered the boat to withdraw toward Rendova Harbor for rearming, but 11 other PT boats still carried torpedoes, and those boats were repositioning for second attacks. Division III, patrolling near Bambari Harbor, had watched Division I and II's attacks from 5 miles south. Now they moved north to intercept the Japanese sweep. At 00:27 hours, PT-164 spotted Arashi silhouetted against the faint glow of fires still burning on the water where Hajikaze had gone down. Range 2,100 yards. The destroyer was moving slowly, 15 knots, searchlights sweeping methodically across the water. PT-164's commander, Lieutenant Henry Brantingham, calculated an approach from the stern. The destroyer's attention was focused forward and to the sides. No one was watching behind. PT-164 advanced at 12 knots, just fast enough for steerage, slow enough to minimize wake. The two other boats in Division 3 followed 200 yards behind. They closed to 1,400 yards, then 1,100 yards, then 900 yards. Arashi's searchlights continued sweeping, but the beams passed over the PT boats without stopping. The dark grey paint and low profile made them invisible against black water. At 0041 hours and 800 yards range, Brantingham fired both port torpedoes. 2 seconds later, he fired both starboard torpedoes. 4 Mark VIII torpedoes running at 36 knots toward an unsuspecting target. Brantingham didn't wait to observe results. He opened throttles and turned hard to port, accelerating to 38 knots. Behind him, the other 2 Division 3 boats fired their torpedoes. 8 more weapons in the water. At 0043 hours, 2 torpedoes hit Arashi simultaneously. One struck the stern, detonating directly beneath the R5-inch gun mount. The explosion severed steering control and jammed the rudder hard to starboard. The second torpedo hit the engine room. The blast ruptured fuel tanks and destroyed the starboard propeller shaft. The shaft, spinning at 400 RPM when it broke, tore through internal bulkheads like a spear. Secondary explosions followed as fuel ignited. Within 30 seconds, Arashi's entire stern was engulfed in flames. The destroyer's magazine, containing shells for the 5-inch guns, cooked off at 0044 hours. The magazine explosion was visible from Rendova Harbor 12 miles away. An orange fireball rose 300 feet into the air. Arashi's hull lifted out of the water, broke amidships, and settled back as 2 separate pieces. The stern section sank immediately. The bow section remained afloat for 90 seconds before following. 310 sailors died in the explosions. 23 survived, swimming in burning oil. The remaining 2 destroyers, Amagiri and Shigure, abandoned their sweep and formed a defensive circle. Both ships went to maximum speed, 30 knots, and began continuous evasive maneuvers. Zigzagging, figure eights, random course changes every 40 seconds. Their searchlights swept constantly. Their 5-inch guns fired at anything that moved on the water. They fired at floating debris. They fired at their own shadows. They fired at phosphorescent wakes that might be PT boats or might be porpoises. The discipline that had characterized Japanese destroyer operations for 2 years was cracking. Officers were shouting. Lookouts were reporting contacts that didn't exist. Gunners were firing without confirmed targets. The circle formation made them predictable, despite the evasive maneuvers. PT boats positioned outside the circle could wait for the destroyers to zigzag toward them. Division 4 had been patrolling the southern approaches when the first attacks began. Now they moved into position 3 miles south of the defensive circle. At 012 hours, PT-157 and PT-171 began a coordinated high-speed attack run towards Shigure. Both boats accelerated to 40 knots. Their combined wakes created phosphorescent trails visible for miles. Shigure's searchlights found them at 1,600 yards. The destroyer turned to face them, presenting the smallest target profile. Its forward guns opened fire. Shells bracketed PT-157. One passed directly through the boat's thin plywood deck without exploding, entering starboard side and exiting port side, leaving 2 holes 14 inches in diameter. The shell's passage was so fast that the wood didn't splinter. It simply punched clean holes. PT-157 kept charging. At 0117 hours and 400 yards range, PT-157 fired 2 torpedoes. PT-171 fired 2 torpedoes 3 seconds later. Shigure attempted to turn, but had committed to facing the attack. The destroyer couldn't evade 4 torpedoes spread across 60 yards of ocean. 1 torpedo hit below the waterline forward of the bridge. The explosion buckled hull plates and flooded 3 compartments. Shigure lost speed, dropping from 30 knots to 18 knots within 20 seconds. The destroyer was crippled, but not sinking. Its guns continued firing. At 0123 hours, PT-162 attacked from the opposite side. Two more torpedoes hit Shiga amidships. The second hit detonated the forward magazine. The explosion broke Shiga's keel. The destroyer folded in the middle like a closing book. Both halves sank at 01:39 hours. One destroyer remained. Amagiri, already damaged from the first attack, was alone in Blackett Strait. The PT boats had sunk 3 destroyers in 90 minutes, but the cost was mounting. PT-166 had been hit by a 5-inch shell at 01:18 hours. The shell penetrated the engine room and detonated the center Packard engine. Gasoline ignited instantly. The crew had 12 seconds to abandon ship before the fuel tanks exploded. PT-153 had collided with floating debris at 35 knots, tearing open the bow. The boat was taking water and limping back toward Rendova at 8 knots. 8 PT boats remained combat effective. Their fuel was running low. Their crews were exhausted. But Amagiri was still afloat, and as long as one Japanese destroyer remained operational, the mission was incomplete. At 01:45 hours, Amagiri's captain made his decision. The supply mission was abandoned. Survival was the priority. The damaged destroyer turned north toward Rabaul and opened throttles to maximum speed. At 01:47 hours, Amagiri was making 28 knots on a course bearing 340 degrees, heading directly toward Rabaul, 180 miles northwest. The destroyer had taken 1 torpedo hit, flooding 2 compartments, but the pumps were holding and the engines remained functional. Behind Amagiri, 8 PT boats began pursuit. The nearest boat was PT-109, now rearmed with 4 fresh torpedoes after a high-speed run back to Rendova. Searles had his engines at maximum throttle, 41 knots, but the range was 8,000 yards an opening. Amagiri's captain knew exactly what he was doing. A 2,090-ton destroyer running at 28 knots could maintain that speed for 12 hours. PT boats running at 41 knots burned fuel at 300 gallons per hour. At that consumption rate, they had 40 minutes of pursuit fuel remaining before they would need to reduce speed or risk running dry. The mathematics were brutal. Amagiri was pulling away at 3 knots differential. Every hour, the destroyer gained 3 nautical miles. In 40 minutes, it would gain 2 miles, putting range at 10,000 yards. At 10,000 yards, PT boat torpedoes were at maximum effective range, assuming perfect firing solutions and ideal water conditions. Neither existed at night in open ocean. Searles needed to close to within 1,000 yards for a reliable shot. That meant making up 7,000 yards of distance in 40 minutes before fuel forced him to break off pursuit. The oil temperature gauges on all 3 Packard engines were reading 220 degrees, 20 degrees above recommended maximum. The engine mechanics, working in the cramped engine room while the boat pounded through waves at 41 knots, were monitoring bearing temperatures and adjusting cooling water flow. One engine failure would drop PT-109's speed below 30 knots. The destroyer would escape. At 02:15 hours, Amagiri altered course 10 degrees to starboard. The turn was slight but significant. Searles studied his chart. The new course would take the destroyer through an area where American submarines had been reported earlier that day. The Japanese captain was being cautious, altering course to avoid potential submarine positions. The maneuver reduced Amagiri's speed momentarily as the destroyer turned. For 18 seconds, the ship's speed dropped to 24 knots. In those 18 seconds, PT-109 closed 600 yards. Range was now 7,400 yards. Still too far, but the gap was shrinking. Behind PT-109, 2 other boats were maintaining pursuit. PT-157, the boat that had taken a shell through its deck without exploding, was running at 39 knots with minor engine damage. PT-162 was making 38 knots. 3 PT boats against 1 destroyer. If they could reach firing range before fuel ran out, they could attack from 3 angles simultaneously. Amagiri couldn't evade 3 directions at once, but the clock was absolute. At 02:28 hours, Searles calculated remaining fuel. 22 minutes of pursuit speed fuel left. Range to target was still 6,800 yards. He needed to close 5,800 yards in 22 minutes to reach 1,000-yard firing range. That required a closing speed of 15 knots differential. He was only gaining 3 knots. The numbers didn't work. Unless something changed, Amagiri would escape. At 02:34 hours, PT-157 tried. Range was 7,200 yards, beyond effective torpedo range, but within maximum range. Lieutenant Brantingham fired both port torpedoes on a long shot, hoping for luck rather than precision. The Mark VIII torpedoes ran at 27 knots for maximum range. Their fuel would last approximately 12 minutes at that speed, giving them 6,000 yards of travel distance. They missed. Both torpedoes passed 400 yards ahead of Amagiri's bow. The destroyer didn't even maneuver to avoid them. At 02:38 hours, PT-162 fired from 6,900 yards. 2 more torpedoes. Both ran deep, passing under the destroyer's keel without detonating. The magnetic exploders failed to trigger. 4 torpedoes expended, 0 hits. 4 PT boats remained with torpedoes. 3 were miles behind, too far to catch up. Only PT-109 had position, and PT-109 was running out of fuel. At 02:41 hours, Searles made his decision. He would run the engines until they seized or until fuel tanks read empty, whichever came first. No reserve, no safety margin. Everything committed to closing range. He pushed the throttles past their stops, forcing the Packard engines to 4,700 RPM, 200 RPM beyond red line. Oil temperature climbed to 235 degrees. Bearing temperatures reached critical levels. The engine room mechanics reported number 2 engine was showing metal particles in the oil. The engine was eating itself from the inside. It would fail soon. But PT-109's speed increased to 43 knots. The closing rate improved to 5 knots differential. Range began dropping faster. 6,000 yards. 5,500 yards. 5,000 yards. At 05:58 hours, the eastern horizon began to glow. Dawn was 30 minutes away. Amagiri's captain increased speed, squeezing every possible knot from his damaged destroyer. The ship accelerated to 30 knots. The range stopped closing. For 6 minutes, PT-109 and Amagiri ran parallel, neither gaining nor losing ground. Then number 2 engine failed. The Packard seized with a grinding shriek of metal on metal. The propeller stopped turning. PT-109's speed dropped to 36 knots. Range began opening again. Searles had failed. The destroyer was escaping. Then, at 06:04 hours, Amagiri turned. The destroyer altered course 15 degrees to port, probably adjusting heading for final approach to Rendova Harbor. The turn reduced speed to 26 knots for 20 seconds. In those 20 seconds, PT-109 closed 400 yards. Range dropped to 4,200 yards. Still too far, but the turn had given Searles something else. A better angle. PT-109 was no longer chasing Amagiri from directly astern. The turn had opened the angle to 20 degrees off the destroyer's port quarter. Searles could now fire torpedoes on a lead course, aiming ahead of the target. He studied the range, the angle, the closing speed. At 06:11 hours and 3,800 yards range, he fired his 2 remaining torpedoes on a 90-degree deflection shot. The torpedoes would run across Amagiri's projected path. If the destroyer maintained course and speed, if the torpedoes ran true, if the exploders worked, the weapons would intercept the target. 3 ifs. 50% odds at best. At 06:13 hours, both torpedoes hit. The first struck Amagiri forward, buckling the bow. The second hit amidships, exactly where the first torpedo had hit 90 minutes earlier. The double hit on the same location broke through the temporary repairs. Water flooded the destroyer's center compartments. Amagiri's bow lifted. The stern settled. At 061 Sethane hours, the fourth destroyer slipped beneath the surface. 4 destroyers, 8,400 tons of warships. One night, 15 plywood boats had accomplished what battleships couldn't. They had stopped the Tokyo Express. At 0620 hours on August 2nd, 11 PT boats limped into Rendova Harbor. 2 boats were missing, sunk during the night's fighting. PT 109 was running on 2 engines, the third seized beyond repair. PT 157 had a 14-inch hole through its deck. PT 162's bow was crumpled from collision with debris. 8 American sailors were dead, 14 were wounded, but on the chart table in the operations tent, 4 red markers had been removed. 4 Japanese destroyers confirmed sunk. Amagiri, Hagikaze, Arashi, and Shigure. Combined tonnage, 8,400 tons. Combined crew, 1,280 sailors, of whom fewer than 200 survived. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost in one night what it took 2 years to build. The Tokyo Express never ran Blackett Strait again. On August 3rd, Japanese naval headquarters in Rabaul convened an emergency staff meeting to analyze the disaster. The VOR official report, later captured by American forces, documented the engagement in technical detail. 4 destroyers dispatched on routine supply mission. All 4 sunk by coordinated small boat attacks using torpedoes. The report's conclusion was stark. PT boats were no longer negligible threats. They were credible warship killers. Imperial Navy doctrine was revised immediately. Destroyers would no longer conduct solo supply runs. All Tokyo Express operations would require cruiser or battleship escort. High-value destroyers would be reserved for fleet actions, not transport duties. The revision meant Japanese garrisons in the Solomon Islands would receive fewer supplies at greater intervals. The strategic impact of one night's combat would cascade through 6 months of subsequent operations. American naval headquarters responded with equal speed but opposite conclusions. On August 5th, the Chief of Naval Operations received a classified report detailing the Blackett Strait action. The report included engagement timelines, torpedo expenditure rates, and cost analysis. 15 PT boats, combined cost $3,750,000, had destroyed 4 destroyers worth $8 million. The return on investment was 213%, not accounting for the strategic value of stopping Japanese resupply. The Pentagon immediately authorized expansion of PT boat production. In September 1943, 12 new PT boat squadrons were commissioned. By December, that number reached 40 squadrons. Production facilities at Elko, Higgins and Huckins Boatworks went to 3-shift operations. The August night in Blackett Strait had validated 2 years of experimental doctrine. Small, fast, expendable craft could kill capital ships if employed correctly. Equipment improvements followed combat lessons. Radar sets became standard installation on all PT boats by October 1943. The TBY-1 radar that had given PT-109 first contact with the destroyer formation was retrofitted across the entire PT boat fleet. Torpedo reliability became a priority engineering problem. The Bureau of Ordnance, which had denied torpedo malfunction reports for 18 months, finally acknowledged systematic failures. By January 1944, modified Mark VIII torpedoes with improved exploders began reaching Pacific squadrons. Dud rates dropped from 50% to 15%. Radio coordination protocols developed during the Blackett Strait action were formalized into doctrine and taught at PT boat training schools in Rhode Island and Florida. The statistical record of PT boat operations validates the transformation. Before August 1st, 1943, PT boats had sunk 0 destroyers in 18 months of Pacific combat. Between August and December 1943, PT boats sank 9 additional destroyers. In 1944, that number increased to 23 destroyers plus 14 cruisers and over 150 barges and transports. The plywood boats that Imperial Navy officers had dismissed as hakuge, mosquitoes, accounted for more Japanese destroyer losses than American submarines during the same period. The cost-effectiveness remained consistent. Average PT boat cost, $250,000. Average destroyer cost, $2 million. Kill ratio, 8-1 in favor of plywood. Individual crews from the August 1st night received recognition. Lieutenant Searles was promoted to Lieutenant Commander and awarded the Navy Cross. Lieutenant Brantingham received the Silver Star. 12 enlisted men received Bronze Stars for valor. But the real recognition came from Japanese sources. Captured documents from late 1943 showed revised Japanese naval training manuals. New sections addressed PT boat threats. Recommended tactics included continuous evasive maneuvers, searchlight discipline, and avoiding predictable routes. The Imperial Navy had added PT boats to the threat matrix alongside submarines and aircraft. The mosquitoes had become wolves. The long-term legacy extended beyond World War II. Modern fast attack craft doctrine traces directly to PT boat tactics developed in 1943. Israeli Sa'ar-class missile boats, which sank Syrian warships in 1973, employed the same coordinated wolfpack approach Searles used in Blackett Strait. American Cyclone-class patrol boats and Freedom-class littoral combat ships are direct descendants of plywood PT boats, substituting aluminum and steel for wood, but retaining the same operational concept: small, fast, heavily armed craft operating in swarms against larger opponents. The Navy's current distributed maritime operations doctrine, which emphasizes multiple small units coordinating attacks against concentrated enemy forces, is exactly what 15 PT boats executed on August 1st, 1943. Physical artifacts survive. PT 6117, an Elco 80-foot boat identical to those that fought in Blackett Strait, is preserved at Battleship Cove in Fall River, Massachusetts. The boat's plywood hull, Packard engines, and torpedo tubes are maintained in operational condition. Visitors can stand on the deck where crew stood during combat operations. They can see the cramped quarters, the minimal armor, the exposed fuel tanks. The preservation makes the impossibility tangible. This wooden boat, barely larger than a school bus, fought steel warships weighing 40 times more. PT 109, the boat commanded by future President John F. Kennedy, was lost in Blackett Strait 2 weeks before the August 1st action. Kennedy survived and later wrote about PT boat operations. His descriptions of the fear, the adrenaline, and the absurdity of charging destroyers in plywood boats remained consistent with accounts from August 1st crews. The men who fought that night carried the knowledge forward. They returned to civilian life, understanding that technology and tactics could defeat superior force. That coordination multiplied individual capability. That courage combined with innovation could reverse mathematical impossibility. The lessons transferred to business, engineering, and military planning for 50 years after the war. Today, the last surviving crew member from the August 1st action died in 2019 at age 96. But the boats remain in museums, the tactics remain in doctrine, and the story remains as proof that sometimes plywood and desperation defeat steel and certainty. The Imperial Navy laughed at PT boats until 607 hours, August 2nd, 1943, when the 4th destroyer sank and the laughter stopped forever.